Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the HIPS and SIPS 9.0 webinar. This is the schedule for today. I'll proceed with a slideshow interspersed with some live demonstration. This will take about 30 minutes. There'll be some time at the end to answer some questions. Presenting today is Burns Foster, that's me. I'm the product manager for HIPS and SIPS, and Dan Morash is one of the veterans from our HIPS and SIPS support team.
Just before we start, remember to keep your microphones on mute throughout the webinar. If you have any questions, please type them into the GoToMeeting dialog, and we will answer them as many as we can at the end of the webinar. After the webinar, we will circulate the questions to all of the attendees, including answers to any of the questions that didn't get addressed before the end of our time.
And just before we talk about HIPS and SIPS 9.0, for those of you that aren't existing clients, CARIS is a company that provides GIS software mostly to the hydrographic and marine community. CARIS has been in business for almost 35 years, and our software products are used all over the world. We have about 170 people in 4 offices, most of those in New Brunswick, Canada. We focus primarily on marine GIS. And for any that aren't familiar with HIPS and SIPS, it's a comprehensive sensor data processing system. We support over 40 industry formats and easily handle large volumes of data. For more information, you can check out our website or contact us directly. Okay, so today we're here to talk about some of the new features in HIPS 9.0 and give some live demonstrations. The biggest change we'll look at is the new interface and some of the new tools and workflows that go with it. We'll also look at our new multi-sensor support for navigation and touch on some of the new supported file formats in this release as well. The first thing you'll notice when you open HIPS and SIPS 9.0 is the new interface. For anyone that has used our ping-to-chart software, it will look familiar. We brought HIPS up to the same level as our other products. That also means we have access to some new tools we didn't have previously, which I'll talk about more a little later.
The new 9.0 interface could not be any more user-friendly, with highlighted areas showing the user where the docking of a window will occur, to a complete restructuring of the menu bar so that each function is now in a more organized location. The other major interface change was an upgrade to all the icons, giving them a sharp new look.
Okay, so we'll show you the interface here in a few minutes. The biggest functional change in this release is the addition of support for multiple positioning systems. This is something new for HIPS. In the past, we could only support one sensor type at a time, primarily because our own HIPS format could only support one at a time. To do this for HIPS 9.0, we took lessons learned from our water column support, and we no longer store post-processed navigation in our internal HIPS format. Instead, anything you bring in from the Load Navigation Attitude dialog is simply indexed and attached as an available navigation source. For each line, you can then pick which source you want to use for processing, and the navigation is read directly from the raw file on demand.
Does this mean we don't store navigation in the HIPS format at all in 9.0?
Well, we store the original navigation from the raw file in the HIPS format, with one exception. For any clients working with Kongsberg data, they have the option to use the new direct reading method or store that navigation in the HIPS format like they used to. So the nice thing about the new direct read method for the Kongsberg format is it will read multiple position sensors from the raw file directly if they're available, and you can use any of them in processing right away. And we'll show you a bit about that later as well. Now, to work with the new multi-sensor support, we also redesigned the navigation editor. Each time series graph is now its own dockable window, and you can turn each graph on and off independently. Each graph also includes an overview of the whole time series. With a time slice tool, you can use to navigate and narrow or expand how much data you're looking at.
It also makes finding outliers really easy.
Another benefit of the direct reading is we can hook into information we couldn't before. So when it's available in the source data, we also show graphs of auxiliary information like HDOP, PDOP, and the number of satellites. And while we were at it, we also replaced the Attitude Editor with the same controls. Now, the interesting bit here is the old Attitude Editor had filters and smoothing tools, so we had to implement support for that. That means the Navigation Editor now has the same filters as the Attitude Editor, and you can apply those filters based on any of the available data.
So that means I could filter my navigation based on PDOP or standard deviation?
Right, exactly. And the smoothing was a bit trickier, so that's currently only available in the Attitude Editor. On the workflow side, we've simplified things a lot with this release. We used to require users to make a field sheet, basically a container for all of your products. That's gone now in 9.0, so now both surfaces and mosaics are created directly from the process lines. On the mosaic side, our existing users will be happy to know we've done away with the per line mosaics called geobars. Now you simply select your lines, configure your processing options, and the mosaic is created. If you will need to adjust brightness and contrast on a per line basis in the mosaic after it's created, you just tick a box when you create the mosaic to enable that functionality. The other improvement on mosaics is the whole mosaic brightness and contrast adjustment is instantaneous now, no matter how big the mosaic is. And on the vector side, we now have access to the same tools as our other ping to chart software. So now you can create an empty vector layer and just start digitizing, pulling in features from other layers, or running the contouring or sounding selection processes.
I think it's a good time to show everybody what this looks like.
That is a good idea, Dan.
So now we'll take a look at the new interface first off. We can see at the top here as I scroll across with my mouse all of the new icons that have been upgraded for this version. In addition to that, as I scroll along the menu bars, we can notice that things have definitely changed for the good. Everything is now in a much more user-friendly, organized location. So spend a little time, get used to that, and it's going to definitely make more sense than before. In addition to that is just undocking and docking of windows. So if I double click on my attribute window and bring it back over, we can see right now it's undocked, but as I move it around this area right here, we can see by the blue highlighted area where I could actually dock it to. In addition to that, we can see tabs down here. You can undock your tabs, and to redock it as a tab, you're going to put it to the middle position, not to one of the sides, to the middle. And when I release my left mouse, it's going to now dock within as a tab. So that's just moving around. Now let's take a look at the new navigation editor. Now before I go into the navigation editor, I'm going to quickly select one of my lines here. So click on my ship track lines, select one of my lines, and go over to the attribute. And over in the attribute, we can see that we have both the sources of position as well as we have our nav source that is for that the current line. So now moving into my navigation editor, we can see that things are definitely different, and I already have a few windows open, but I'll explain that as we go through this. So every window can be its own window, so if you have a second monitor, that's going to definitely be of use to you. Same thing as I previously said, when you select and drag one of these around, you can see you can dock them within an existing open graph or the graph window, or you can just dock it in some of your space. So to add or remove some of these windows, you're simply just going to right click on your ship track line. There's windows, and then you can see the check marks is indicating that it is currently open. So if I clicked on my course made good, now that particular window has been removed. In addition to that, down at the bottom here, we have what is called the overview. So you can have an overview of all the data from this current line we have selected, and at the top here, that information is being depicted by what's in our yellow slice. So you can change the width of your slice, changing the amount of data that's being shown. You can scroll across here, going along the line of data. And if you want to maximize that real estate within this window, you can do a right click and you can actually hide that overview. As you can see, the overview is only going to be hid on a per window basis. So you'd have to go to each one of these to remove them. However, when I move my yellow slice, it's going to actually change that for all the current windows that are in the display. So in addition to that, we'll also notice that what we were looking at previously in the attribute window, we have two sources of navigation here, one being red and one being green. Now the colors of these can be simply updated by, again, going to your layers window and selecting on one of your sources and changing or updating the color under your generals in the property. You could also turn off one of those sources. So if you have more than 2 or 3 or 4 in there, you can turn one of those off just to minimize the clutter within that window. Clicking back on my navigation editor tab, we can see this is, for those of you that have used HIPS and SIPS before, this is going to look very similar. Well, it's actually exactly the same as the attitude editor's options. So we have our view, our scale options, and then down here at the bottom we can enable our filter and turn on the various lines available to that. Now, the one thing you will notice that is different from the attitude editor is that smoothing is not available within navigation editor. You can still use that in your attitude editor, just there wasn't enough time to add that particular function. So the one other thing that we can look at, if you've gone through this and you were happy with all those changes, you could go back out and you could change the actual source. So if I wanted to go with something different from the source one that was applied, I could exit out of here. I could select the line of interest that I'd like to make that change of, and then I'd go up to my process navigation, and there is your set source in which you can change the source type for that particular line to whatever you would like to utilize for the line or lines that have been selected. Now, doing something a little different here, we're going to bounce over to the to our vessel editor. And the one thing that I would like to mention is if you're working with multiple sources of navigation, there may be different offsets here. By default, you would have a navigation source, and let's go in here and take a look before I continue explaining. You'd have your navigation sensor in which you'd have your offsets. Now that would be applied to all the various sources if you did not add anything else. So by default, it's going to use that if nothing else has been added. But if you would like to add additional offset settings, you can go to this icon right here, which is going to open up your add navigation source, and you could enter in or turn on one of the other available sources and put in your offsets right down here, and then save that and apply. So I'm not going to save that, and I'm going to continue on by taking a look at the, let me see, the surfaces and mosaics. So first off, we'll do our surface creation of a new base surface. So selecting all my lines, I'm going to go right here to my new surface icon, and I'm going to click on that, and then I can browse, and here's where I can choose wherever I'd like to add that .caesar and .caesar file. So just giving it a name, and click save, and next. And now on the next page, this is where you're going to actually define your extents and what coordinate system you'd like to output. So I'll just use my display for my extents, and the coordinate system does not have to be what you're currently using in the view. It doesn't actually have to be what you have set up to the properties. It can be whatever you would like to. But by default, whatever you have in the view is going to be added to here when you first open that up. So going next again, there's nothing new to any of the additional steps once you define those first few parameters, and then you could go right into the creation. So I'm going to cancel out of this. We already have created a surface, and then you'd have your nice surface created. The next thing we're going to take a look at, selecting my lines again, is the new mosaic. So clicking on that will open up my mosaic window. And just kind of working from the top first, we have our selection where you could use either a single line or multiple lines going by what you have selected. And then under source, you're going to choose whether you're working with side scan, geocoder data, and that type of data you're working with. Jumping down to the bottom, under the advanced options, there's really only configuration where you can click on the browse and enter in any of the advanced options available there. Just above that is where all of your imagery corrections are. And then moving up one more, we have our output and the extents. Now this is important because before you can actually click OK, you're going to have your extents defined of the area you'd like to output that mosaic. You're going to have a coordinate reference system defined, and you're also going to have a location that you'd like to put this Caesar surface. So just saving the name and location, we can see now my OK is not grayed out anymore, and I could export that particular surface. I'm going to cancel out of here because again we've already created a mosaic and we have our mosaic created. So in addition to that, your first day is complete. You collect your second day's worth of lines. You could select those lines and then you could go to your tools, mosaics, and add that to the surface. Now I'm just going to go in here briefly. And we can see this is all the same, but the important thing is here that we do not have to use the same corrections we used the previous day. So you could put in whatever new imagery corrections to these new lines that you'd like to. In addition to that, if there was one particular or a few lines you'd like to apply different corrections to, you could go through those same steps, get to this window, and update that with a different grouping of coordinates to apply to that exact same portion of your mosaic. So the one other thing that I'm going to talk about is the raster exports. So once you've generated these products and you're ready to export these out, you can go to the File, Export, and now you're going to see the raster product. Now when you go into here, you could do a drop down and you'll see the few options under your raster DM and also a raster image, our geotiff. So these you can select and you can do an export one at a time to export all those. The one other option that you have is the generation of a template. So if you're doing this on a daily, weekly basis, and the products that you're exporting are the same, then this is definitely a tool that you'd like to utilize. So you can go in here, give it a name, and you can enable exactly what you'd like to export from the components available. Once you've done that, you can go over here, fill in all that information, and now when you come back in next time under your products, that template will be there and you could reuse that on whatever basis you're outputting that information. So Karen Cove is going to cover that more in depth during the Bathy database webinar, which is going to be coming in the upcoming days. So thank you, and I'm going to pass this over to Burns to continue on.
All right, thanks, Dan. And I'm going to bring up some different data sets. Okay, so the other thing I wanted to talk about today is the new vector tools we have in the application. I mentioned that we have integrated with the common application framework here at CARIS, which gave us some new capabilities, particularly around creating and managing features or vector products. So to demonstrate that, I also wanted to show a new format we're supporting now in 9.0, the Kraken InSAS format. So this is synthetic aperture sonar data to go along with our Raytheon ProSAS and the Kongsberg HiSAS support we have in the application. This stuff is basically very high resolution imagery and bathymetry in some cases as well. That gives some really nice quality products coming out the other end. So synthetic aperture sonar, just at a high level, is using a stable platform like an AUV with sort of an interferometric sonar of a source to synthesize a very long array. And that allows you to generate very high resolution images. So the great thing about this stuff, for instance, with the Kraken data, you can have up to about a 3 centimeter resolution consistently across the entire swath. So the resolution does not degrade as you go to the outer part of the swath, like it does with with some other systems. So, excuse me, I have some data imported here into HIPS and SIPS, some track lines. In this case, there was only just a port side head, which I'll show you in a moment. And each one of these lines represents a frame from the SAS system. So to virtualize this array, they sort of lump up a certain number of consecutive pings and process that data as one. So each one of those frames comes into HIPS as an individual line source. So that's something particular to the Kraken format, which of course is not a problem. So I've gone ahead and generated, in this case, a 5 centimeter mosaic just to keep the math even, but it can go a little bit finer from this. This is some data from Kraken directly showing, in this case, some really nice lobster pots and a few other features I'll talk about here in a second. So we're going to use this very high resolution, very detailed imagery to generate a few products. So I'm going to digitize some things directly off of this data. So the first thing I'm going to do is make a new feature layer. So all vector products are digitized on these new feature layers. For anyone familiar with Base Editor or S57 Composer or other Ping-to-Chart tools, this would be a very familiar step. So I'm going to generate a new layer, a new empty layer. And in this case, I'm going to use a custom catalog we have here for SSDM. So that's a seabed survey data model, very common in the oil and gas industry. Something we're working on to put into a product release, actually. So we're slowly implementing this catalog definition that sits alongside, of course, S57, VPF, many other definitions we have built into the software. So in this new empty feature layer, all the vector products I create are going to be using this new catalog system. And this will be available in an upcoming release. So the first thing I want to do, I've got a couple of lobster pots here. I'm going to pick those off directly from the mosaic. Of course, I'm going to go through SideScan Editor as well. And I'm going to digitize point to start. In this case, I only have one point type in the catalog at the moment, so it's gone straight to that one. And in this case, the symbology ID is mandatory, so I'm going to set that as a fish trap. I'm not sure that's 100% accurate, but good enough for a demo. And I'm going to go through the mosaic and simply digitize. This is very coarse, of course. Normally, you do this in a little more sophisticated manner, but for a demo, this will serve our purposes easily enough. So we're still working on the symbology for SSDM. The point types at the moment don't have a symbology, so they'll just show up as question marks. But of course, the features are there to see. So there's a few lobster pots. I can show digitizing a line. So we're going to do a seabed feature line. In this case, for lines, I have multiple types, so it's asking me which I'd like to use. And we're going to digitize, there's some anchor scars, or what look like anchor scars, just a little bit to the west here. So I'm going to grab those. Again, very rough, quick and dirty. For the purposes of the webinar, I'm just going to pick off some of these scour features. Close enough for now. And that's that. So, of course, this scour feature actually does have the symbology done. We have that in place, so that shows up symbolized properly under SSDM. And some other nice new capabilities we have around features. I can actually take, there's another type in SSDM for the survey lines. So I have some survey lines here in HIPS. I want to bring those over to my SSDM compilation. And I can actually use a tool called Import Selected Objects. And this is something very common on the vector world for our products. So I'm going to import those to my feature layer. So directly from the HIPS data, I'm going to import these track lines into my new demo feature layer. And I'm going to change the object acronym type to be a native SSDM type. The nice thing about this is if I had it available, I could actually set up some mapping rules to map from the HIPS catalog into SSDM directly and apply that here in this dialog. At the moment, we just have the stock HIPS to S57, which is available in the release. But of course, I could define a second rule that maps it to SSDM and use that here. But for now, I'm just going to do it manually. So I'm going to define this as a survey track line type in the destination SSDM layer. And I'll set my symbology ID. In this case, I believe we're at the RP for the navigation. So I'll set that navigation at RP. And there we go. So if I turn off my HIPS data, so I'm only looking at my features. So just a quick and dirty, I have some track lines coming in. And of course, I can look at the attributes for each one of those. I can set things like the date of survey, line name. That's something I could have mapped from the source. Data source, things like that, I could have populated automatically with some mapping. Also have the anchor scar. So again, some various attributes I could define here, things like the length, width, and height. I could measure that through a combination of some of the HIPS editors, various other sources as needed, and of course the lobster pots here. Again, I could populate these, say, in side scan editor to measure the dimensions of each of those pots, and so on. And so that gives me a compiled SSDM feature product. And so now I want to look at exporting it. So the great thing about being on top of this common application, we have access to lots of new export types. Of course, things like DXF, shapefile, S57, and GML and KML. So very nice new feature in 9.0 to go along with base editor 4.1 is the introduction of translation for the GML export. So GML is really a flavor of XML, and XML has something called style sheets under XSLT. And what you can do with those is effectively translate from one flavor of XML to another. Now, in the application, you can define these translations from GML to any export of your choice and point the application at that translation file. And when you do that, you give it a name, and that name will show up here in the menu. So effectively, we have given users the power now to write their own vector product export functions using this XSLT file. And it shows up directly in the application as one of the menu export options. So some very powerful tools with this release. So that's just a very high-level overview of some of the new tools we have. Okay, just before we go, I wanted to give everyone a sneak peek at an upcoming update on 9.0 that has a few improvements, primarily around AUV support. So the biggest change is we have replaced the load navigation attitude, delayed heave, and RMS dialogues with a single load auxiliary data dialog. This new dialog is based on the Raster product export dialog you saw earlier in the demo, which is great because you can set up some common configurations and save them as a template for reuse later. We're also adding support for 2 new post-process formats, Kongsberg's NavLab and Fugro's Starfix formats. We also have improved support for data from Kongsberg's HiSAS system and other Kongsberg AUV configurations, so watch for that. For our subscription members, you can download HIPS and SIPS 9.0 directly from our website. For non-members, contact your account manager or send us an email.
Keeping connected with CARIS is really easy. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available for viewing on the CARIS YouTube channel. You can see our URL for that on the screen. We are also on mediums like Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter.